Good evening and welcome to tonight's session on behalf of the Football Clinic, MIHP and Nuffield Health. My name's Manny and I'm the practice manager for the Football Clinic. Before we start, just to make everybody aware, this session is being recorded and a link to the recording will be shared via email with everybody within the next few days. First of all, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of you for coming along, both all the people here that are able to join us in person and also to everybody online as well. This evening is the fourth session in a series of presentations on injuries in professional athletes, and tonight's agenda covers a variety of topics. So let's have a look at the agenda. So you can see the agenda here. So what I will do is I will top and tail the main presentations with a few words on the Football Clinic and MIHP, and then we'll finish with a tour of the facilities as well as dinner. Okay, so as usual, I won't go through everything that's on this slide, but I do want to take just a few minutes of your time to highlight some of the services available. So especially relevant to tonight is the cardiac screening and the concussion screening services that are available here at MIHP. So our speakers this evening actually run these clinics. So we have Anil, who runs the cardiac screening clinic, and Hiran, who runs the concussion screening clinic. And if anybody wants any further information about these screening clinics after this session, then please feel free to get in touch with MIHP or indeed any one of us, and we can point you in the right direction. Likewise, if anybody needs any imaging requirements, again, get in touch with us. There's great facilities here available at MIHP, and which Andy will be more than happy to show to anybody who's interested. Andy's the general manager here at MIHP. And even if you've had a scan elsewhere, God forbid, then do remember that we have a reporting service that we provide as well. So just get in touch, and our radiologists, where are they? There's Waqar there, Gulraiz there, more than happy to provide an opinion on any scans, which you can send through, for example, by Pax Mail. The address is there. As it says on the slide, same day reporting, and it's not just the reporting. If you need to do a virtual meeting as well, we can do that, and not just having the virtual meeting with the radiologists. If it's appropriate, then we can always pull in the likes of Neil, consultant orthopedic surgeon, and Steve as well, physiotherapist. So that's that. And I'm definitely going to remind everybody about this one. So our free telephone advice service. So this is the one, some of you will be familiar with it, is where we set up a WhatsApp group between our group of experts and any staff from your club, where you can ask opinions about any injuries. And we've had some really good positive feedback about that. So if that's something that interests anybody, you think you could get something out of that, then please just let us know. Happy to set that up. Okay, final point from me. There will be CPD certificates issued to everybody, and that's everybody here and online as well. So for those of you in the room, there's a list at the front. Please add your name to the list if you haven't already done so, in order to get your CPD certificate, and we'll email that out within the next few days. Okay, now it's time for the main presentations. Right, we'll move on to the next presentation, which is by Steve.
Evening, everybody. Again, thanks a lot for the invite of Subject, nothing to do with the previous topic, so just going to discuss some of the management of quadriceps injuries in elite football. Okay. So just as an overview, probably talk about the incidents, some of the data that we've got from the FA sort of international studies and some of the previous studies from Jan Ekstrand's work. Look at some of the mechanisms that are often involved. Give you an idiot's guide to applied anatomy with some experts in the room, so I'll be very quickly corrected if I'm not bang on there. Talk about some of the risk factors, and then just give you a really quick overview of the rehab principles. Really sort of the brilliant basics, hopefully. It's far and wide where we can go, but I'll give you where the sort of areas where I'd head to make a start on that. Okay. So when we're looking at the incidence of injury, so the John Orchard, the AFL studies, did highlight that the incidence of pre-season injuries with the RecFem was higher, and this pattern hasn't been seen in sort of future studies, the early ones in the EFL in 2002, and with more recent ones with the FA sort of injury audit, where there has been some discussion of whether that pre-season incidence, the introduction to kicking early on in the season, may be something that increases the prevalence in that area. Re-injury rates are quite high as well. And it's taking significantly longer sort of periods to rehabilitate following that re-injury. So we'll have a look at that sort of data there as well. Just looking at the table there, so we can see that when we're looking at the initial findings, the sort of prevalence is lower than your hamstring injuries. So we've got 17% sort of prevalence there on the hamstrings and only 8% in the quads. And then obviously adductors sort of 14% and calf muscles. The interesting data, I think, on that table, which is worth having a look at, is that sort of severity. So you've got, you're looking at a hamstring, there's 11% of those injuries are looking at over that 28 days in comparison to sort of 15% with those quadriceps. So there is that risk, that increase in burden, injury burden with the quads injuries, and probably more specifically the RecFem sort of injuries. Okay. Looking at some of the FA injury data, which is sort of summarised in the next slide, so I'll probably move on because that's not the most exciting slide there. But this is the data which is collected on over sort of 950 days with over 16,000 days of injury in there. So whilst it's only international data and they're only on Kemp for sort of between 60, 70 days a year, we have found it is very similar and quite accurate to the EFL and sort of Premier League based studies. So when just summarising that sort of data, we sort of 7% frequency in the seniors compared to less frequency in the youth, and the days absent was significantly different from the senior team. Some of the senior teams, which is sort of from I think we took that at 21s and seniors compared to the PDP and YD phase compared to the youth phase there. Interestingly, with the women's data and the there was a lower incidence of those sort of RecFem injuries compared to the men's data. And similarly, we've mentioned it before, looking at that RecFem data, the return to play times were longer in those senior injuries and the incidence was higher in those senior teams rather than the men's data. And this is slightly different than some of Jan Ekstrand's research. When we're looking at so we're looking on this graph here, this is men's youth. Along the bottom, we've got the incidence of injury. So how many injuries per 1,000 hours. And the other axis, we've got the mean days absent. So when we look at it in the youth, we can see that it's in this bottom left sort of quadrant, which is where you want to be for your injuries. So the incidence is relatively low and the mean days lost is relatively low. So it's not that much of a burdensome injury. If we look above, we've got a shoulder region injury, so it's maybe less common, but we know that mean days absence is going to be higher. The interesting thing when you look between the men's youth data and the men's senior is suddenly when we look at the quadriceps, we've drifted up. So we've come out of that bottom left safe quadrant and we're drifting up into the last place you want to be is top right, and we're drifting towards that area. So when we're looking at this data, it's far more burdensome, excuse me, even than some of the hamstring injuries as well. Okay, so looking at some of the mechanisms of injury. So sprinting is probably the first one that you'd have a look at. We've got sprinting, which is this rapid hip extension and rapid knee flexion. Maximum elongation is going to occur around 55% of that sort of gait cycle, and it's just initial ground contact of the contralateral limb. So again, when we're looking at someone like Jain, we can see that we're getting this rapid hip extension, rapid knee flexion. So we've got this huge eccentric force where we're trying to decelerate the tibial, the shank, as it goes into this sort of knee flexion position. We go on to some of the applied anatomy, but we've got this fusiform muscle, which has got this tendon which wants the muscle to be lengthened, and wants to work under considerable strength and at considerable speeds. So this is where the rec fem is likely to come under these sort of stresses. And if the rec fem isn't sort of physically capable to meet the demands of those sports, we're more likely to have this injury. Similarly, but maybe not as much, so the research would suggest that we'll get to kicking, but predominantly it occurs with kicking, but we also see it in that acceleration phases. Braking or that deceleration is less common, because we've got the other quadriceps, which are going to got a larger cross-sectional area, so we're going to take more of that force. However, if this the rec fem is continually loaded through kicking actions and through sprinting actions, then it's not uncommon to see it injured in these braking forces as well. So finally, into kicking, we've got this high angular velocity with this high eccentric activity, which we spoke about. See if that video sort of plays there. That largest angular velocity is going to occur at maximal hip extension and in those kicking postures. So the energy is predominantly going to come from the hip flexors, and then obviously the hip flexion movement is going to be the main drive to those movements. The speed is around up to, we're going to get over 3,000 newtons during this activity, and it's going to happen in a 8 to 9 sort of milliseconds. So it happens very, very quickly. And it's going to be at that change from an eccentric activity, that cocking action there, as we go into a concentric activity. Okay, right. So at the applied anatomy, so apologies for any mistakes in advance. Okay, so we've got these two proximal heads. We've got this direct head, which comes from the anterior inferior iliac spine, and we've got the indirect head, which comes from this superior acetabulum. There is talk, and I'm probably look to the experts in the room, of arguably a third head around this sort of iliofemoral ligament and into towards the glute med sort of insertion, so it can be an anatomical variant. So again, with my limited knowledge of that sort of anatomy, you would assume or think it may have some sort of active or passive sort of stability across the anterior hip, in addition to its actions as a sort of an eccentric sort of muscle. It also has this muscle within a muscle. So we've got this outer, I think the description, best one I liked was think of it like a hot dog. So we've got this outer muscle, which is this outer sort of unipennate muscle, which then comes from the direct head, if that's right. And then you've got this bipennate muscle, which is within, which comes from the indirect head. So there's a few slides there where we sort of get that idea of this muscle within a muscle, and probably the bottom left gives you that sort of hot dog appearance of these unipennate and bipennate muscles coming from different insertions. Probably another nice diagram to sort of see that through is here, of these sort of two muscles within a muscle with separate sort of proximal insertions, and one going into the sort of aponeurosis and one going into this central tendon. Finally, for sort of idiot's guide for the physios in the room, we'll be just looking at that sort of anatomy there. So we've got this sort of gross diagram. So we've got this direct head, and then we've got this indirect head, which is just going over the acetabulum. I think the things to note in this diagram would be the obvious close associations with your hip flexors there. So we know that it is one of the stronger hip flexors when we look at that cross-sectional area. So it has a huge involvement in hip flexion. There we're looking at glute, how close it is to glute min. And then we're also understanding its close proximity to TFL and sartorius. So whilst it is a biarticular muscle, it is going to have a large impact on hip flexion, and probably something which I don't think we pay enough attention in the rehab. Okay, moving on. And then we're talking about those various insertions there. So we've got that into the anterior inferior iliac spine, and we've got that across onto the superior lip of the acetabulum. Okay, so as mentioned before, it's a strong hip flexor compared to the other hip flexors, and I'll show us the next slide, which will show the various cross-sectional area between the hip flexors and between the rec fem. But also, it's a weak knee extender compared to the other quads, which is obvious when we think about it. But if my own personal reflections of how much do we spend working on that sort of knee extension rather than combining those movements, when it actually plays a lesser part of that compared to the other muscles. We talked about this fusiform sort of muscle and this unipennate and bipennate applied anatomy, and it's biarticular, so it's working over two muscles. So it wants to execute movements over significant length with huge shortening of velocity. And we know that its muscle makeup is predominantly type 2 fibers, so these explosive movements. So here, just looking at that cross-sectional area, which will give us an understanding of its strength and its biases to movement. This is rec fem. and these are your vasti. So this is looking at compared to the for knee extension, and then we can look at it there compared to hip flexion. So it's got a greater cross-sectional area than the other hip flexors. So thinking back again, my reflections on rehab is how much attention do we pay to that hip flexion component of the movement really when we're trying to load it up following injury. Another slide, credit to sort of Rob Chakravarti with the sort of BAMIC athletic grading system, and one of the sort of visuals just to understand it. When we're looking at the applied anatomy and we understand the injury, we can look at it in these sort of three sort of simplified areas, and then understanding that the healing is going to take different times depending on what tissues are involved. So that myofascial injuries, tissue healing time is going to be less compared to significant tendon involvement. So are we applying that to our rehabilitation? So being guided by the clinical sort of presentation, but also then understanding the underpinning physiology and anatomy. So a couple of interesting sort of MRs that I've been sent from some of the players. So again, happy for the experts to jump in at any point, but this was a presentation from a player who came on an international camp and had sort of symptoms, which is always a massive concern for us, that we don't injure players and make sure we send them back. And then on imaging, there was this sort of presentation of delayed onset muscle soreness. This was early in the season, going back into pre-season late and going pushed into a pre-season game probably earlier than they would like to. So a significant amount of kicking. This was a centre forward, and this was the presentation that we saw on the imaging. So the player responded well, stayed on camp, but again, a significant sort of imaging, I thought, to see that sort of presentation on someone who almost has a pre-injury, and if managed correctly and recovered correctly, could resolve that quite quickly. And again, I think the interesting thing is looking within that muscle, within a muscle, you can definitely see how the presentation of the rec fem is seen on there. Again, these central tendon injuries, okay, involving that intramuscular tendon, disruption to the myofibrils from the central tendon and create this feather-like appearance. Again, this is this sort of degloving or bullseye sign, which is this, we talked about this unipennate and bipennate aspect of the rec fem, so we're seeing that sort of degloving aspect in that interesting presentation. And then the final one I've noted is those anterior inferior avulsion injuries in those younger athletes, of something to be aware of in the maturing athlete. Okay, so going into risk factors. One of my favourite sort of bumper stickers, I suppose, within sort of injury management is that a footballer's greatest ability is their availability, which is Bill Parcells' quote sort of from the New York Giants and sort of the Patriots time. So you can't help your team from the sideline. So I think understanding that sort of what can the athlete do to make sure that they're always available is really important. And that sort of links on to some of the sort of data we saw following lockdown. So when the athletes came back internationally for sort of profiling, we found that their jump height remained the same and their speed remained the same. But when we looked at their eccentric mean power, that dropped generally about 30% across the group. So what is the consequence? Well, the consequence probably is that's going to come at a greater cost for those athletes. So that deceleration, that eccentric ask we're asking for muscles like rec fem, if it suddenly dropped because the exposure during lockdown was more to concentric activities and they didn't get the exposure to change of direction and pitch-based activities, and that's what consequence was it likely to come from? Okay, so looking at some of the other intrinsic sort of risk factors, some interesting stuff with age. So Jan Ekström studies did not find any correlation with age in the studies that they were looking at. Body weight and height is really interesting. So athletes who are under 1.82 m and had a higher BMA had a higher prevalence of sort of these quadriceps and rec fem injuries. Moving across, the flexibility from the Fusekis' study from the Belgian work saw an increase in risk with reduced flexibility. And previous injury in both the quad and the hamstring had an increased risk for sort of rec fem and quad injuries as well. Dominant leg was more prominent, which would make sense, I think, with that sort of kicking action, and also linking back to that the MR with that DOM sort of presentation. You can imagine if you are going to kick more on that side, you're asking the muscle to do more. There's a greater physical ask to that, so I think it's going to increase your likelihood of injury. And then the eccentric strength was another risk factor. Okay, and then some of the extrinsic factors was pitch hardness and sort of ball weight. Ball weight, I thought, was a really nice one of do we actually manipulate the ball sort of pressure when they're coming back from injury? Can we reduce the ball pressure? So that might be a way to develop that rehab and progress it nicely. Okay, so coming to the rehab principles, I think really just basing it on brilliant basics. So respecting the tissue healing, you know, early on in that, can we understand from the clinical information, from the imaging, understand what tissues are involved? The rehabilitation for a myofascial or a muscle injury is going to be different from the rehabilitation from a tendon sort of involvement. So guiding ourselves clinically on sort of criteria-based outcome, but also respecting that different tissues are going to take longer to heal. What can we change? Well, can we manage? We can definitely change strength. We can increase cross-sectional area. We can increase rate of force development, and we can increase strength through range. We can also impact on pain. We can actually control that pain and work in pain-free ranges. So these are things we can control. And with that re-injury risk, can we objectively progress that muscle, so the local tissue, and then can we look more functionally to ensure that we've hit markers before we return them to play? So just for the basis of this talk, we're going to talk about 3 key areas, and we could go into peripheral neuromobilization and manual therapy and various other areas, but we're just going to stick to these 3 areas really. So we're going to talk about neuromuscular control, look at strength development, and then look at flexibility. Okay. So when we're looking at flexibility, so we're looking at sort of Kendall's work here. So this is the really early sort of physiotherapy text that we look at this general characteristics that you might see of these players that we all see with this increased sort of lumbar lordosis, increased kyphosis, this anterior tilt. And already when we're into that position, it's not going to be understandable that sometimes this cadence length is going to change with these athletes. They're not going to be able to get into this sort of split position. They're going to get reduced cadence, which is then going to cause reduced glute sort of activation and reduced sort of rec fem length. So some of the videos of nothing sort of exciting, but are we looking to maintain thoracic extension? Are we looking to reverse this sort of anterior tilt and maintain that sort of position? So there's some really simple things we can do to make sure that these athletes have the active range that they need when we're going to expose them to these activities. So looking at neuromuscular control. So if we're looking at that rec fem muscle, so if we're looking at prone knee bend, so if we just take the athlete into prone knee flexion, often what we're going to see is that give into anterior tilt. So we're seeing that the tension in that rec fem, that biarticular muscle, is in creating more stiffness than the sort of lower lumbar control. So as a simple test, that's given us an idea of those sort of springs between rec fem and between lower abdominals. Ideally, what we want to do is the athlete could actually go through full range of knee flexion without getting that give into extension. So looking at the rehab video just on the side of the screen there, what the athlete's trying to do there is go into relative hip extension without getting a give into our anterior tilt. So if we're looking at the video there, can he maintain his lower abdominal control whilst he starts to lengthen his hip flexors? And with the knees flexed, then obviously we're going to bring into rec fem into there. Moving on. So an inner range hold test for sort of your glutes. So you're seeing the athlete there who's looking to go into some relative hip extension. Can they go into hip extension without going into an anterior tilt and going into extension of the lumbar spine? And once they can they maintain that through movement? So what you'll often find is they haven't got the capability within the glutes. We get an overactivity of the hamstrings. We get a give into anterior tilt of the lumbar spine. So again, and if we think about that from a rehabilitation perspective, if every time they're running or kicking, they're giving into anterior tilt, we're going to be loading or stretching these sort of proximal insertions of your rec fem. So we need to get an athletes who are able to control that movement. Mentioned already earlier in the talk of the importance of that hip flexor activation. So if we know that it's got a larger cross-sectional area than some of our other hip flexors, are we going to then have to make sure that it's strong into hip flexion? So we can start to load hip flexion, probably in a pain-free way earlier on in the rehab, to make sure that the hip flexors can take more of that load. So just the exercise, just see on the video there, is a simple sort of Pilates-based exercise where we're looking to get the athlete into inner range hip flexion. A simple test to do that without a reformer is just in high sitting. Can you get your athletes just to lift, and how high can you actively come into hip flexion? And what you're looking to do is, can you come into hip flexion without giving into posterior tilt? So can you get those iliopsoas sort of muscles where you're getting a nice range into there? And you'll often find that these muscles can be short, but can also be weak in that inner range. And if they're weak in inner range, then obviously you're going to get a bigger ask onto your rec fem. Okay, so we've covered some of the neuromuscular control. These are the basics you can start really early on the rehab. And then the final area, and probably the area you want to spend most time, is that strength development. Okay, so first and foremost, I think respecting tendon healing is the most important thing we need to do. We want to load it as early as we can. We don't want to provoke, we want to allow the tissue to heal, but at the same time we want mechanotransduction, so we want to put a load under that tissue and want to actively encourage that scar development in the right sort of plane of movement. So we can start this early with this isometric loading. We're going to put that into, we can put it into posterior tilt, so we're controlling that proximal insertion of rec fem, and then we can progressively load. And as we're loading, we're going to consider that with open chain or closed chain, and I'm going to progress that through range. Again, we'll probably start with that hip-based movement, and then we can go into that knee-based movement. So the video sort of failed on there, but the video was just to show some isometric work using sort of force frame or Kangatech or force decks in a way where you're pushing into an isometric contraction. That might be a hip flexion movement, might be a pro knee bend. And then the second video is looking at the standing leg. So don't think about the leg that's moving, but just that isometric activity of the quads. Like that. So we're looking to fire up that, give that a challenge, and looking to increase that sort of how much requirements are in that quad. The rec fem's in a nice safe position there. We're bent forward into sort of relative hip flexion, but we're keeping that in a short and isolated position, but we can start that early on in the rehab. Okay, so that eccentric power. So we all understand about breaking strength and eccentric power in sort of Nordics, but we've got the option for reverse Nordics. How can we put an eccentric load through this muscle at the right period of time? So we might do it through a knee extension to start with. Sorry, resisted yet knee extension, or we might do that through the hip as well. And we can progress that to lengthen the muscle as we need to. We know that ball contact is going to be up to 3,000 newtons at 9 milliseconds. So we're going to have to get to those speeds at some point in the rehab. So we need to start off slow and build that up. So, yep, some examples of that. We've got these sort of flywheel sort of techniques. So again, we're in a seated position, so we're not biasing that proximal insertion, so we can start that relatively early. We can then progress that seated position if we wanted to. So I think isokinetics is a really nice one for this sort of activity of you can start in a seated position, then go into a full sort of supine position to really start to lengthen those tissues at the right point. This flywheel technology, which is allowing that big load on that eccentric recoil, you can see there is something we can use. And more simply, we can sort of use the reverse Nordic as well. I mean, the greatest thing about the hamstring exercise is it's super maximal and you're self-limiting. So as soon as you get to the level where your hamstrings can't cope, you can drop out of it. Similar with that, with some support with the reverse Nordic, we can start to load those tissues. And again, the picture that's up there is a flywheel. So we looked at, can we attach that and do some nice open chain work where we're working this flywheel. And as you kick through the flywheel, the yo-yo sort of is going to recoil and pull it into that position. So we can change positions to load the tissue in more lengthened positions. And then just on the breaking strength, this is a video not of someone with a rec fem injury, but this is someone who's got decreased eccentric power. And if we look at that functionally, he doesn't want to attack the change of direction at high speed. So he's slowing down as that entrance to in the entry into a sort of 180-degree turn. And we can see the amount of time they're losing on that turn. So if we haven't got the ability to absorb that eccentric power on that change of direction, that's when we're going to get exploited when we return to play. So pain might reduce, but if the athlete's still unable to perform at those higher levels, they're going to get found out from a performance point of view. So as an example, can we start to encourage them into that eccentric position and breaking right through range and changing direction? So not just for a rec fem injury, but more specifically for sort of the quads and that deceleration moment. And again, if you're looking for just one simple exercise to sort of cover that, we can go into that split squat. We're lifting up, pushing with 2 legs, and then really dropping down, controlling with 1 leg. So again, if there was one exercise, we were really just trying, as one example of trying to load up and have that additional weight. So pushing up with 2 and taking all the weight on that front leg and lowering down eccentric overload. Okay, so that rate of force development we've sort of spoke about. So we've already spoke with the anatomy of this rapid, high velocity, rapid changes in length. We talked about the speed of the ball. So we really need to make sure that we're doing things explosive. So when we're looking at rate of force development, to improve rate of force development, we need to hit maximum force, so we need to improve cross-sectional area and strength, but then we need to increase muscle stiffness, and we need to do that as quick as we can. So again, this is a sort of athlete early in that phase of just absorbing into that eccentric phase early in his rehab, and then someone later on their sort of rehab post ACL of just using the weight to sort of get a stamp to activate that rate of force development, dropping the weights and exploding there. So we see a really early stage exercise based with a sort of more later stage. And what we're looking to do is, can they hit those maximal forces in a shorter period of time? Because if we understand the speed that these athletes are going to be kicking at, if we don't address that rate of force development, we're going to come unstuck when we ask them to do things quickly. So in summary, so a whistle-stop tour of just some of the really key, brilliant basics, hopefully, was respect that healing, you know, get the knowledge and experience of specialists who understand that and can give you a good information of how long we think that's going to take to heal. That's not to say we just manage things off the scan. We link that closely in with the clinical presentation. But with such a significant injury of rec fem, making sure we're getting that information along the rehab, understanding the anatomy, understanding the tendon, but if the tendon's involved, the importance of that eccentric strength and rate and force development, making sure we have that neuromuscular control through range, and don't be afraid to think about the synergists. So, you know, whilst we're working the rec fem, we can also work in the hip flexors and the knee extensors.
Thank you, Steve. Any questions from the audience here? Any questions online? No?
Yeah.
That flywheel,
Yeah.
flywheel, how does that compare to a traditional manometer?
I think the best way to describe that is the amount that you put into that on the concentric phase, you're going to get back on there, so you can really attack it and you can build the speeds up. So with, I think, dynamometer sort of on an IKD, you can definitely get a similar sort of effect. You just would have to stop and change the speeds and stop and change the speeds. Whereas with the flywheel, you can sort of build into those, and you can also push with 2 and then control back with 1, if that makes sense. So you can sort of build into that. Whereas IKD is again another option, which I think is nice because you're going to get all the objective outcome from that, and you can progress that up as well. So
that relates to how much concentric force?
Yeah, the concentric force you get in, you get sort of back in return. So it's quite easy for the athletes at the start. They can start slow and then it comes back slow, and then as they get more confident, they think they've got to give that and control that. And probably a little bit cheaper. But the IKD, ultimately, I really like the idea of in that seated position and then dropping back into that supine position, because then you can slowly start to get the eccentric force in the really sort of lengthened positions.
I'm interested in the split squat that you showed.
Yeah.
The guy doing it with the weights.
Yeah.
Leaving the weights, doing it again.
Yeah.
Doing it with the weights again. What was the thought process behind that?
I think so.
Do you just repeat the question in case it wasn't heard online?
No problem. So the question was regarding the exercise on the split squat, holding the weights. So that was just to get that eccentric overload, so to create a supramaximal sort of load where you concentrate on lifting the weight with 2 legs and then really isolating the leg that you're lower in front or back to get more load onto that tissue. So I think it was a lift with 2 and then really then dropping onto 1 leg, so you're really overloading 1 leg, which earlier on in the rehab would probably be the front leg, because what you've got, it's in a shortened position, and then later in the rehab you probably emphasize more weight pushed through the back onto the bench to try and load that sort of tissue.
Okay, and the last
hurry up, I'm hungry.
the last presentation from Neil.
I don't know about anyone else. I feel like Greavesy now looking at that picture in the state I'm in right now. That was when I was younger, more athletic, but I still continued to eat, and now I'm hungry as well. So rather than go through the case, what we'll do, I'm going to use this opportunity just to wrap up a little bit and then hand over to Manny and Andy to wrap up properly. Like we said before at the football clinic, at these CPD sessions, these evenings, we want to invite you guys to come and share some topics, some cases yourself. And so I want to use this again as an invitation to anybody here and those online as well, to invite you to reach out to us and say, you know, you've got an interesting case, you want to share it with us. You may have shared it with us on the WhatsApp groups for a bit of chat and a discussion. And I think we want to develop that learning group between us where we know we're safe amongst friends, we're not going to judge, and we're just going to share knowledge. And so I'm going to get that started with a bit of homework. I'm going to give a scenario, and then we're going to go through it in more detail in a proper case discussion at the next meeting, when we'll allocate some more time to it. So the scenario is a 30-year-old attacking right winger who's 4 months away from the World Cup, is their nation's top player in terms of attacking, and unfortunately, they've just torn their ACL. It's a home World Cup for them. It's really important. It's getting towards the twilight years of their career. They're really, really keen on playing. Now, conventionally, I think we all know what the decision would be, but I want to just take the next few moments, maybe the next few weeks, maybe a couple of months, depends when the next meeting is. Just think about the challenges that faces, both in terms of the individual, the club, the country, the profession. And then we'll discuss that in more detail as a case study at the next CPD evening, because I'm pretty hungry as well now, so we need to eat too. All right. Similarly as well, I forgot, I'm going to say it, yeah, sorry, I was prompted. Similarly as well, if there's any particular themes or topics anybody wants us to cover in these evenings, please do let us know, and we'll tee them up and arrange to cover anything people want to have covered as well. And as you can see from our guest speakers tonight, many thanks to Anil and Hiran to speak on the wider aspects of football, not just MSK stuff. I think vitally important. So massive thank you to both of you for speaking with us tonight as well. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Neil. So I'm not sure if there's any further questions. I think you've all done really well to ask them as we've been going along. So we could probably move on from there. So we're literally almost done. Won't take too long now. As we said earlier, if anybody would like a tour of the facilities, then come and see Andy. Andy's at the back, the general manager. So as soon as we finish in about a minute, and Andy will be happy to show you around. That does bring us to the end of tonight's session. And to echo what Neil just said, thank you to all the presenters. Thank you to the staff here at MIHP. But most of all, thank you to all of you for coming along, and everybody who's taken time out online as well. Thank you very much. As Neil said, this is the last session actually of this season. So the next session will be when the next season starts. So we're probably looking at about 3 or 4 months away. So that gives you plenty of time to work up super duper answers to the case study. Okay. Other than that, we look forward to seeing you all at the next session, and thank you once again. All right. Thank you.